I never thought freedom would sound like gravel crunching under my tires, but that's exactly what it felt like the day we pulled our trailer onto 20 acres of untouched Arizona land. After years working inside courthouses, watching people lose their property over inches in paperwork, I was finally stepping onto earth that was mine, clean, clear, and completely outside any HOA's reach. My kids jumped out barefoot, my wife kicked off her boots, and for the first time in a long while I felt the world go quiet. It lasted all of 3 minutes. A white SUV with a massive Canyon Ridge HOA logo came tearing up the dirt road like they were serving a warrant. Out stepped a woman in khakis and pearls, Karen in her final form, flanked by 2 men dressed like discount security guards. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask a single question. She pointed at my land, my family, my equipment, and barked, "You're trespassing. You have 15 minutes to leave." That was the moment I realized something. They hadn't just picked the wrong property. They'd picked the wrong man. Before we jump in, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there, and if you've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare, hit subscribe so you won't miss how this one ends. When that woman barked at me to leave my own land, something inside me went still. Not angry, not yet. Just still, the kind of stillness I learned in the Marines right before things turned ugly. My wife froze mid-step near the garden stakes she'd just laid out. The kids stopped laughing. Even the wind cut out for a second. I straightened up, slowly dusted off my jeans, and reached into the truck for the one thing I always kept close whenever land was involved, my black survey folder. Years of boundary disputes, court hearings, and legal maps had taught me one truth: you can argue with a lot of things in life, but you can't argue with a recorded deed. The woman in pearls didn't care. She strutted forward with that HOA swagger I'd seen 100 times in court. Chin-lifted eyes, narrowed expression permanently stuck between superiority and constipation. The 2 security guys flanked her like she was a visiting dignitary. Neither wore badges and their uniforms were mismatched, but they sure acted like they owned the place. "This entire tract," she said, sweeping her hand, "dramatically falls under Canyon Ridge HOA jurisdiction. You are in violation the moment you step foot here." I held up the folder. "Ma'am, this parcel isn't under any HOA. It's county registered, privately zoned, fully independent. I've got the deed, the boundary survey, and the plat map right here." She snatched the folder, flipped the first page open for maybe a second, then without reading a single line, tossed it back against my chest like it offended her manicure. "This," she sneered, "is irrelevant. Our development plan includes this land. It's earmarked for community integration." I raised an eyebrow. "Community integration? This land is a mile outside your subdivision." "Not anymore," she snapped. "We have expansion rights." I almost laughed. "According to who?" "The board." She smirked at her own answer. One of the security guys stepped past her, grabbed my generator by the handle, and started dragging it toward the SUV, as casually as if he were returning a shopping cart. The other approached my tool rack, eyeing my gear like he was preparing for a yard sale. "Hey," I barked, stepping forward. "Don't touch my equipment." Karen crossed her arms. "They're removing unauthorized structures. You weren't approved by the Design Review Committee." "There is no committee," I said. "There is now." I looked at her closely, then really looked, and realized I wasn't dealing with someone misinformed. I was dealing with someone drunk on power. Someone who believed that a little printed newsletter and a board position turned her into the governor of Arizona. She gave the 2 men a sharp nod. "Proceed." That was when the first guy made his mistake. He glanced back at me with a smirk the kind men wear when they think intimidation is a skill. He dropped my generator with a thud, planted his boots wide, and put his hand on the baton hanging from his belt. "Sir," he said, "step back." I stood exactly where I was. "I'm on my land." "Not anymore, you're not." I gave him one warning, the kind drilled into me through a decade of military training. "Touch that baton and we're done talking." He smirked again and lunged. Everything after that happened in seconds. I stepped sideways, pivoted, caught his wrist before the baton, cleared the loop, and swept his legs. He hit the dirt, hard breath bursting from his lungs in a single sad wheeze. The second guy dropped the generator and rushed me. I grabbed his collar, twisted, and planted him face first into the red earth. He started spitting dust, cursing, calling me names that lost their sting years ago. Both men were groaning on the ground before my wife even had time to gasp. I brushed off my sleeve. "Next time," I said calmly, "don't touch my equipment or my land." Karen screeched like someone had set her HOA dues on fire. "You just assaulted my security personnel. You're going to jail," I shrugged. "Call the real authorities, please." And she did, furiously stabbing at her phone while pacing back and forth like a rooster hyped up on caffeine. 15 minutes later, a sheriff's cruiser rolled up the dirt road, angling slightly, lights off, dust trailing behind. The deputy stepped out with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen everything Arizona could throw at him and was unimpressed. He looked at me, then at the two men still rolling on the ground, then finally at Karen, who immediately launched into a breathless monologue about trespassing bylaws violations and violent attacks against HOA staff. The deputy held up a hand. "Ma'am, stop." He turned to me. "Sir, you got ID." I handed him my license and the black survey folder. He flipped through the documents, carefully lingering on the deed, the meets and bounds, the county seal. He checked his in-car computer. He stepped back out. Then he said the 6 most beautiful words I'd heard all month. "Ma'am, this land isn't yours." Karen sputtered. "What? That's incorrect." "Our development plat clearly." The deputy cut her off. "Your development plat means nothing out here. This parcel is private property, county registered, outside HOA jurisdiction. You're trespassing." The two men on the ground sat up straight. "And as for you two," the deputy added, "I have 1 witness and 1 recording," he tapped his body cam, "that one of you initiated physical contact." The bruised one stammered, "I barely touched him." "That'll do." The deputy walked over and snapped a pair of cuffs on him with the bored professionalism of a man who'd done this 1,000 times. Karen shrieked, "This is not over. We will be filing an." The deputy held up a single finger without looking at her. "Ma'am, leave." She looked like she was about to explode into confetti, but she left. As the SUV peeled away, throwing dust across the canyon ridge, I felt something heavy leave my chest. Not relief, not yet, but clarity, the kind that tells you a storm is coming long before the clouds move in. My wife came to stand beside me. "What just happened?" I looked out across our land, the long shadows stretching across the juniper trees, the kids hugging each other behind us, the generator still sitting stubbornly in the dust. "They tried to claim what isn't theirs," I said quietly, "and they chose the wrong family to mess with." I didn't know then how deep the trouble ran. I didn't know what they'd do next. I didn't know they would go so far as to forge maps, conspire in secret meetings, or even try to rewrite county records to steal our land. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty: this fight had just begun. If the confrontation on day 1 was the spark, the next 48 hours were the kindling dry brittle waiting for the first gust of wind to turn everything into a wildfire. As the sheriff's cruiser disappeared down the dirt road with one of Karen's security officers sulking in the back seat, I thought naively that the situation might cool off. After all, most people would take a public humiliation like that as a sign to back down. But Karen wasn't most people. Karen was a professional escalator, the kind who believed losing just meant you hadn't threatened enough people yet. The very next morning, long before the sun cleared the ridge, I stepped outside with a steaming mug of coffee and listened to the quiet. The desert at dawn was my kind of church, nothing but wind-distant coyotes and the soft shifting of sand. My kids were still asleep, my wife sketching layout ideas inside the trailer. For a moment, it was peaceful. Then I saw the tire tracks. Fresh ones. Deep ones. Too wide for a normal SUV, too recent to blame on the sheriff, and leading directly across the northeast edge of my property where no one had any business driving. I crouched down, pressing my fingers into the dirt. The soil was still soft, disturbed within hours. Someone had been here again. I didn't need a detective to guess who. I followed the tracks along the ridgeline until they curved back toward the county road. There were no footprints, no litter, no obvious signs of who had made them. But I'd worked enough cases to know that lack of evidence is its own kind of evidence. Someone had been careful. Someone who didn't want to be seen. Someone who thought they were entitled to access my property because a glossy HOA handbook told them so. My jaw tightened. That morning, while my wife cooked breakfast and the kids argued over who got to collect firewood, I did 2 things. Installed 3 trail cameras with motion detection and infrared vision. Printed and laminated a dozen private property, no trespassing, under 24/7 surveillance signs. I didn't put them up as threats. They were documentation, receipts for the court, breadcrumbs for anyone foolish enough to try me again. By noon, the signs were staked every 100 feet along the boundary. By sundown, the cameras were synced to my phone, and by the next morning I was glad I had prepared, because the mail truck arrived. The driver, a skinny guy with a sunburn and a friendly but exhausted smile, handed me a thick ivory envelope stamped with a logo I now recognized like the mark of a predator, Canyon Ridge Hoe. "You guys new out here?" he asked sympathetically. "Pretty new." He tapped the envelope. "Yeah, good luck with that." Then he drove off, leaving me standing in a swirl of dust with a package that felt heavier than its weight. My gut sank. My instincts whispered one word: ambush. Inside the envelope was a perfectly bound packet of papers, printed on expensive cardstock. HOA letterheads, tables, signatures, and a smell of smug self-importance. The first page knocked the wind out of me. Notice of fine, $8,000, violations unauthorized. Structure non-compliant aesthetic elements, tent off-grid energy system, gas generator failure to submit architectural plans, and unpermitted occupancy. I read it twice, then a third time. Then I laughed, because the alternative was punching something. There was no aesthetic committee. There were no community standards. There was no universe in which my land a full mile from the nearest house could fall under their jurisdiction. They were inventing laws like a kid invents rules mid-game to avoid losing. My wife scanned the rest of the packet and muttered, "I swear, if they weren't so dangerous, they'd be funny." Behind the fine was another document titled HOA Quorum Ruling on Parcel Reclassification. According to the handwritten notes, the board had met informally over lemonade and vodka spritzers and voted to reclassify my land as a prospective integrated development tract. Translation: they sat in someone's living room and pretended to legislate. Then came the map. A ridiculous hand-edited diagram showing the canyon ridge boundary stretched like warm taffy, its edges redrawn to swallow my 20 acres like a python swallowing a rabbit. The new line didn't match the county plat, didn't match any survey ever recorded, didn't even match basic geography, but it matched their ambition, it matched their delusion, it matched their desperation. At the bottom of the document was a signature, Karen Stoddard, HOA president. Below that were 3 names I didn't recognize, plus one signature that looked suspiciously like Karen's handwriting done with her left hand. My wife paced the dirt, cursing in a way the kids were definitely not allowed to hear. "We should shred this garbage," she said. "Mail it back with the kids' mud pies labeled as aesthetic violations." I almost agreed. But courtrooms reward patience, not rage. Instead, I sat on the tailgate and dialed an old colleague, someone who had survived more property disputes than I had. A quiet, meticulous man named Howard, who now worked at the county recorder's office. When I explained the situation, he sighed the way government employees sigh when someone tries to overthrow zoning laws using crayons and confidence. "Send me everything," he said, "and expect a call from the prosecutor's office." I scanned every page, highlighted the discrepancies, and emailed it all. Then I filed a formal written complaint with the Navajo County Prosecutor's Office, attaching scans of the fake maps, a side-by-side comparison of the real county plat, a notarized affidavit of ownership, and a request for a fraud and harassment review. I also wrote a certified letter addressed to Karen herself. Nothing dramatic, just clean, precise legal language. Cease and desist all claims, contact, or attempts of enforcement pending formal legal review. Further harassment will be documented and submitted as part of ongoing evidence. I didn't expect her to be scared. I expected her to be furious, and I was right. That night, long after the kids went to bed, I stepped outside to refill the generator. The canyon air was cold, crisp, a little too quiet. Then, from the corner of the ridge, a pair of headlights blinked on. Not approaching, just watching. The engine idle rumbled across the dark. I shut off my lantern and crouched behind the trailer. Slowly, carefully, I lifted my phone and zoomed in. Even from a distance, the silhouette of the SUV was unmistakable. The same white one, the same shape, the same arrogance parked at the edge of my world. For 10 long minutes, it sat there, silent, predatory, claiming territory with presence alone. I unclipped the bear spray from my belt, not because I needed it, but because preparation mattered. Finally, the SUV backed away, lights still off, retreating into the night like a cowardly ghost. By morning, I had had enough. I bought more trail cameras, installed them along every boundary, reinforced the signs, documented everything in multiple copies. If they wanted a war of appearances, I could give them a war of evidence. The next evening, they escalated. Flyers appeared in neighboring mailboxes, glossy, high-quality smear campaigns titled "UN Regulated Squatter, Camp Threatens Canyon Ridge Safety and Values." The accusations were laughable, illegal well drilling. We had no well livestock without permits. Our chickens were fully legal, foreign contractors. My wife's cousins, born and raised in Arizona, but one line caught my attention. Unpermitted land. Occupation may trigger legal intervention. I read it twice. Occupation. Like I was staging a rebellion instead of assembling rain barrels. And that was when I realized this wasn't petty HOA annoyance anymore. It wasn't even about power. This was a hostile takeover attempt. They weren't just trying to intimidate me. They were trying to establish a paper trail, a fake legal narrative they could wave around later. That meant one thing: they were getting desperate. And desperate people make sloppy mistakes. I didn't know it yet, but Karen had already made her biggest mistake. She had forged a document, one with a county seal, and forgery. Forgery wasn't an HOA issue. Forgery was a crime. And I was about to expose every last piece of it. The morning after the smear flyers showed up, the air felt different. Not colder, not hotter, just heavier, like the sky itself was waiting for something to snap. My wife was inside sorting the kids' clothes, and I was outside leveling the ground where the prefab foundation would go when I heard the familiar rattle of the mail truck barreling up our makeshift driveway. The driver leaned out the window, giving me one of those tired, sympathetic looks only postal workers seem to have mastered. "Another one for you," he said, handing over a thick envelope heavier than the last. Same ivory paper, same Canyon Ridge HOA letterhead, same arrogance. The moment I touched it, I knew this wasn't a warning. This was the next phase. I thanked him, waited until he drove off, and stood alone in the dust. I should have gone inside. I should have waited for my wife. But the curiosity, or maybe the anger, was getting harder to hold back, so I opened it right there on the tailgate. Inside was a packet twice as thick as the $8,000 fine they'd sent before. Except this one wasn't full of threats. It was full of fiction. The title read Community Standards Enforcement Action, Parcel Integration Review, and Mandatory Compliance Order. Just those words alone told me Karen hadn't simply doubled down, she'd gone full zealot. This wasn't someone testing boundaries. This was someone rewriting the rules to justify the game she already decided she was playing. The first page was something called an Advisory Integration Notice. It claimed that my land, my 20-acre county-recorded, officially zoned private land, had been administratively incorporated into Canyon Ridge HOA's future development plan. I read the page again, then again. Administrative incorporation. That was not a legal term. That was something you came up with after 2 glasses of cheap white wine and a power fantasy. Below that was a list of violations, new ones. Unauthorized grading of soil, non-HOA, approved perimeter trenching, lack of architectural submission for future dwelling structure, unregistered utility components, failure to comply with Canyon Ridge Community Aesthetic Vision Statement. They were just making nouns and adjectives handshake in the dark at this point. But the pièce de résistance was the attached expansion map. This thing, this masterpiece of delusion, looked like a high school geography project someone had done after skipping the tutorial. The HOA borders were drawn in thick red marker. They expanded the subdivision's boundary all the way past the creek, across the ridge, through the dry wash, and deep into my land, stretching their finger-painted empire like a child laying claim to every slice of cake on the table. And at the very center was my parcel number circled 3 times, labeled Future Community Integration Zone, Phase 2. Phase 2. They were naming their imaginary conquest in phases. My laugh was short and humorless. I'd seen people do reckless things in land disputes, neighbors building fences over survey lines, developers accidentally tearing down old trees to force easements, HOA boards fining residents for having the wrong shade of beige. But this was different. This was fraud. Organized, calculated, and escalating. My wife stepped out of the trailer and saw my face. "What now?" she asked, wiping her hands on her jeans. I handed her the packet. Watching her read, it was like watching a storm form. Her eyes narrowed, then widened. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, she let out a sound somewhere between disbelief and fury. "Oh, absolutely not," she snapped. "This woman has lost her mind." She stomped circles in the dirt, muttering curses I hadn't heard since her sister's wedding. The kids peeked out the door, sensing the tension. "Are we in trouble?" our oldest asked. "No," I said firmly, "but they are." Because now Karen had crossed the one line no one should ever cross. She had put something in writing that contradicted county records. That meant she wasn't just a bully. She was a forger. And forgery isn't civil. Forgery is criminal. I grabbed my phone, walked to the far end of the property for better reception, and called Howard, the county recorder contact I'd spoken with the day before. He picked up on the second ring. "You've got more for me, don't you? You have no idea." I explained everything. The map, the administrative incorporation, the violations, the expansion lines that stretched like a cartoon villain's mustache. I scanned all 37 pages and emailed the packet to him, annotated with notes and references to the actual county plat. He was quiet for a moment. Then he sighed a long, exhausted exhale, meant exclusively for situations where people try to rewrite legal boundaries with crayons. I'll forward this to the assistant district attorney, he said, and to the real estate fraud investigator. This goes beyond normal HOA nonsense. This looks like attempted boundary conversion, a phrase you never want to hear unless you're the one reporting it. And one more thing, Howard added. Do not throw anything away. Keep originals, keep digital scans, keep timestamps, and under no circumstances respond to them directly. Already on it, I said. But here's the thing, I had responded. Legally, professionally, through a certified cease and desist letter, and I sent Karen a copy. That night after dinner, I went out to check the generator. The moon was half full, the desert quiet. But something felt off. You know that instinctive twitch between your spine and your gut that tells you you're being watched. That feeling was loud tonight. Then I saw the headlights. Again, the same SUV, same silhouette, same slow approach along the ridge. Only this time it didn't just idle. It inched closer, creeping like a predator testing territory. I ducked behind the water barrel's phone-ready recording. The SUV parked directly across from the boundary marker engine, rumbling like a growl. A door cracked open. A figure stepped out, small, stiff posture, holding something rectangular. I zoomed in, a clipboard. Karen. She stood there staring at my sign, scribbling notes like she was assessing a crime scene. She circled a word, gestured angrily in the air, then snapped a photo with her phone. Then, just as quietly, she got back in the SUV and drove off. That was the moment I realized Karen wasn't just stubborn, she was planning something, building a case, creating her own twisted narrative. If she wanted a case, I'd give her one, a real one. The next morning, I installed 2 additional trail cams hidden, this time facing the ridge. I also reinforced the boundary stakes with reflective markers and GPS coordinates written in permanent ink. Then, with a coffee in hand and frustration simmering just below a boil, I sat down inside the trailer and began assembling a formal complaint document titled Chronological Record of Unauthorized HOA Activity, Evidence Packet A. It had timestamps, transcriptions, scanned documents, comparison overlays, legal citations. And as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house we'd almost lost twice, I made a promise to myself. Tomorrow I wouldn't just show up to court as a victim. I'd show up as the person who ended Karen's reign. Not just for my family, not just for our home, but for every neighbor she'd terrorized along the way. The storm was finally coming to a close, and I was ready to watch her empire fall. GPS logs, and a summary of the sheriff's intervention. By noon, it was 43 pages long. By dinner, 68. By midnight, 93. And by the next morning, I emailed it along with the new evidence of nighttime surveillance to the prosecutor's office under the subject line, Escalation of Fraudulent HOA Enforcement and Suspected Document Forgery. That afternoon, I received a reply. Short, direct. The kind of message that shifts everything. We are opening an investigation. Please provide all digital and physical materials at your earliest convenience. My heartbeat steadied. For the first time since Karen showed up, I felt something close to relief. But the storm wasn't over. Karen wasn't done. Not even close. In fact, her biggest mistake was still ahead, and it would be the mistake that finally brought her HOA empire crashing down. The day after the inspectors left, I woke up knowing something had shifted. Not outside the Arizona desert looked the same as always, but inside me. The fear had burned off. The uncertainty had hardened. What was left was a kind of cold, steady focus that reminded me of the hours before deployment, that razor clarity, when you know a confrontation isn't coming, it's already here. I started the morning by checking the trail cameras. All green. No movement overnight. My wife brought me a mug of coffee, kissed me on the shoulder, and asked, "So what's next?" Now, I said we go deeper, because it was no longer enough to defend myself. I needed to expose what Karen and her board had been doing long before I arrived. People don't escalate this fast unless they're trying to hide something big, and I intended to find it. I spread everything out across my folding table, every fake notice, every map, every forged seal, every recorded trespass, every flyer accusing us of imaginary crimes. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up the county website. I began tracing the history of my parcel, not just a few years back, but decades. That was when I found the first crack. The chain of title history for my land stopped abruptly in the mid-90 seconds. Normally, you'd see scans of each deed, transfer survey updates, notes from zoning adjustments. but my file skipped almost 15 years as if someone had sliced the digital timeline with a knife. That didn't make sense. County records don't go missing without a reason. I called Howard. Anything weird ever happen with parcel 627B? I asked. He paused. We had scanning issues in the early 2000s. Some records didn't transfer from microfilm. Which ones? He checked. Yours. My pulse picked up. Can I see the originals? He told me to come in. When I arrived, he led me to the basement records room, a place that smelled like dust ink and the ghosts of old bureaucrats. He opened a drawer, pulled out a box of microfilm, and fed it into an ancient reader that hummed like a dying generator. The image came up fuzzy at first, then clearer. It was a county board transcript from 1991. A single line burned itself into my memory. Parcel 627B will remain a privately held parcel and is excluded from subdivision authority. Any future attempt to annex or integrate requires owner consent. There it was written 34 years ago. My land wasn't ambiguous. It wasn't mistakenly excluded. It was intentionally excluded, protected by a county resolution older than Canyon Ridge HOA itself. I photographed the transcript from every angle. Then Howard said, "There's more." He reached deeper into the file drawer and pulled out the original survey plat. The paper was yellowed, edges curled, but the stamp was unmistakable. And next to my parcel number, written in clean surveyor block lettering, not part of Canyon Ridge subdivision, you could have hit me with a baseball bat and I wouldn't have been more stunned. Karen hadn't just overreached, she'd tried to erase history. I thanked Howard, took copies, and walked out of the recorder's office with a new mission: follow the evidence back to its roots and then forward to its consequences. Back home, I called Kevin, the GIS specialist, whose overlays could expose a lie faster than any courtroom argument. I need you to analyze everything I said. Official plat, fake HOA map, BLM parcels, satellite data. Send it all, he said. I did. And 22 hours later, he emailed back a PDF that nearly made me drop my laptop. The overlay showed reality versus HOA fiction in brutal, undeniable color. My land didn't touch the HOA boundary. A 150-foot buffer of county easement separated us. The HOA expansion map intentionally shifted coordinates by hundreds of feet. And 4 houses inside Canyon Ridge were partially or fully built on federal land, BLM trust land, that had never been deeded to the HOA. I stared at the screen for a long time. 4 houses, not one, not a shed, 4 full homes. Karen and her board had been selling exclusive HOA access on federal property as if it belonged to them. They hadn't just gone off the rails, they'd driven through the canyon wall. I printed every page, binded it into a report thicker than a Sunday phone book, and labeled it Documented Pattern of Fraud, Canyon Ridge, HOA. Then I drove to the prosecutor's office. Assistant District Attorney Morales greeted me with the same expression she'd worn the last time: bored skepticism. But the moment she opened the binder, that expression vanished. She flipped to the forged seal. She flipped to the fake expansion boundary. Then she reached the GIS overlay showing HOA houses on federal land. Her eyebrows shot up, her posture straightened, and she asked, "Where did you get this verified GIS analysis?" I said. "Cross-checked with BLM data." She closed the binder. "This is not civil," she said quietly. "This is potentially criminal misrepresentation and federal land misuse." I knew it. But hearing her say it out loud felt like the air in the room thickened. Morales continued flipping pages. Trespassing, harassment, false enforcement, forged documents, sale of access rights to land the HOA doesn't own. She tapped the binder. "This is a RICO case waiting to happen." RICO, racketeering. I had suspected it, but to hear a county ADA say it, that was different. "I'll escalate this," she said. "We'll be in touch soon." Walking out of that office, I felt something I hadn't felt since the beginning of this nightmare: hope. Real hope. Karen wasn't just in trouble. Her entire operation was in free fall, and she didn't even know it yet. Back home, I took every boundary marker I had bought and installed them along the line. Bright fiberglass stakes with orange flags, laminated maps showing the true borders and warnings, quoting Arizona revised statutes about falsifying boundaries. I made the truth visible, unavoidable, undeniable. Late that afternoon, as the sun turned, the Canyon Gold Karen's white SUV appeared again, slower this time. She stepped out, heels sinking into the dirt, and marched toward my signs. She stood there for a long time, staring at the laminated county map, reading the legal citations, taking in the GPS coordinates. Her face went pale, then red, then pale again. She didn't yell this time. She didn't threaten. She didn't talk. She just clenched her jaw, stormed back to her SUV, and sped away. That was how I knew she finally understood. This wasn't a fight she was winning. This wasn't land she could steal. This wasn't a man she could intimidate. And for the first time, she realized something I had known from day one. She had picked the wrong property. But more importantly, she had picked the wrong man. The morning after Karen's face went pale at the sight of my boundary markers, the desert seemed different, sharper, clearer, as if even the landscape knew something irreversible had shifted. I drank my coffee, slowly standing on the ridge, watching sunlight crawl across the junipers. My wife came up beside me, wiping her hands on her sweatshirt. "She's not stopping," she said quietly. "No," I replied, "but she's starting to understand what she's up against." For days I had been pulling threads, and each one unraveled another layer of fraud. But something told me I wasn't deep enough, not yet. HOA corruption isn't built in a year. It's built over decades on small abuses. No one challenges on paperwork, no one reads on intimidation people grow numb to. So after breakfast, I set up my folding table again, spread out the binders, and prepared to dig deeper into the roots of Canyon Ridge. I started with the HOA's own filings, public records, annual reports, meeting minutes. Most of it was fluff: landscaping budgets, pool maintenance, neighborhood complaints about barking dogs, and holiday decorations. But every so often I found something odd. Blank sections, missing pages, deferred discussions, asterisks with no footnotes. You don't need to be a lawyer to know when someone is hiding something. My first real breakthrough came when I cross-referenced the HOA's submitted boundaries with the county zoning maps. Something didn't line up. The HOA's version of their western border drifted nearly 120 feet past the official one. That kind of drift doesn't just happen. Boundaries don't stretch on their own. Someone pushes them. That someone had to be Karen. But I wanted proof, actual tangible proof. So I went back to the microfilm archive this time, not for my parcel, but for the entire Canyon Ridge subdivision. Howard didn't even blink when I asked. "Let me guess," he said, pulling open a drawer. "Looking for inconsistencies. I'm looking for the truth." He smiled thinly. "Same thing most of the time. We fed the film into the reader. The blue glow lit up survey lines, signatures, notary stamps. And there it was, Canyon Ridge's master plan from the early 1990 seconds. I recognized something immediately. The western boundary was crisp, straight, unmistakable, exactly where the county still had it today, nowhere near my land, and definitely not where Karen's expansion map placed it. Howard tapped the screen. "This survey has never been amended. No expansions filed, no annexations, nothing. So the map she sent me, total fiction." That was the moment I realized something important. Karen didn't just fake a single document. She had created an entire fantasy world, an imaginary HOA empire she believed she could enforce simply by insisting loudly enough that it existed. Back home, I spread the printouts across the table. But before I could take a photo for my records, I heard a car coming up the ridge. My stomach tightened too early for delivery, and the sheriff rarely came unannounced. I stepped outside. It wasn't Karen. It was a neighbor. A man in his late 60s climbed out of an old pickup truck. He was tall, sunburned, with a weather-beaten cowboy hat and the tired look of someone who had lived here long before the HOA sprouted like an invasive weed. "You the new fella causing all the fireworks?" he asked. "Depends who you ask," I said. He chuckled dryly, stuck out his hand. "Name's Dave. Used to be on the HOA board before Karen took over. That got my attention." "You left. Left I was pushed," he said. "Karen's got a talent for replacing anyone who doesn't vote the way she wants. Replaced me with her brother-in-law. Replaced our treasurer with her cousin. Replaced the design chair with her best friend from church. Only time that woman likes democracy is when it works in her favor." I invited him to sit with me at the folding table. He glanced at the documents, snorted, and said, "She sent you those." "She did. She's insane." I raised an eyebrow. "You sound like a man with stories." He sighed, a long, heavy sigh, and then the dam broke. He told me how Karen had gradually seized control, stacking meetings, altering minutes, creating committees that never actually met. He told me how she fined a veteran for installing a flagpole without approval, how she threatened a single mother with eviction over a backyard trampoline, how she once made a couple repaint their house because she claimed the color upset the neighborhood feng shui. "She gets away with it," Dave said, "because people are scared of fighting back, or they don't know the law well enough to call her bluff." I leaned back. "She picked the wrong person this time." "Oh," he said, nodding slowly, "I can tell." I showed him the fake expansion map. He laughed so hard he had to wipe tears from his eyes. "She really drew that herself, with a marker," he said. "That woman thinks she can manifest new borders by sheer force of ego." Before he left, he gave me something unexpected, a stack of old HOA newsletters from before Karen took power. They were plain, humble, even friendly. But the moment Karen became president, the tone changed. The language became formal, aggressive, authoritarian. One newsletter from 2 years ago caught my eye. New efforts underway to unify surrounding land parcels for community cohesion. Surrounding land parcels. That meant me even before they knew who me was. Karen had planned her takeover long before my trailer ever rolled onto this dirt. The next morning, I decided to reconstruct Canyon Ridge's timeline year by year, overlaying it with county records and BLM land files. It took hours. But by mid-afternoon, the picture was clear. Canyon Ridge HOA had illegally expanded its internal maps at least 8 times over the last 7 years. No county approvals, no recorded amendments, no boundary surveys. Just made-up lines. And every single expansion overlapped with either private land, county easement, or federal BLM land. It was an HOA land grab masquerading as community development. Around sunset, my phone buzzed. A text from Kevin, the GIS expert. "Check your email. Found something big." I opened his message. He had dug deeper into the federal land records. Something I hadn't known to check, something no average homeowner would think to question, and what he found was staggering. The same federal land that Canyon Ridge was using as community recreation space had never been properly released from federal trust, which meant the HOA had no legal right to build trails on it, maintain it, or most damning of all, sell exclusive HOA use rights to it. Yet they had sold those rights anyway, dozens of times. Karen hadn't just stepped onto federal land, she had profited from it. I stared at the email, my mind racing. If land misuse involves money, and money flows through a board without oversight, and that board uses intimidation and forged documents, you're no longer looking at HOA drama. You're looking at racketeering, the kind of thing state and federal prosecutors salivate over. I stood there in the dimming light, the desert wind brushing against my face, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something almost like triumph rising in my chest. Not because I enjoyed the fight, not because I wanted revenge, but because I realized the truth. Karen wasn't just bothering me. She wasn't just harassing my family. She wasn't just trespassing. She was running an entire HOA regime built on fraud, intimidation, and illegal land schemes, and she'd finally picked a target who wasn't afraid to expose her. I gathered up the papers, stacked them neatly, and slid them into a binder labeled HOA Fraud Master File. Then I placed it on the table and whispered to myself, "You're done, Karen. You just don't know it yet." By the time I finished assembling the HOA Fraud Master File, I felt like I finally understood the beast I was fighting. Karen wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She was the architect of a miniature dictatorship, one propped up by forged documents, bullied residents, and a fantasy boundary map she treated as gospel. And like all dictators, she believed her delusions would hold simply because she wanted them to. But even dictators panic when the ground starts to shake. The first major tremor hit 3 days later. It was a windy morning dust sweeping across the ridge in faint spirals. I was hauling lumber when I noticed something odd glinting at the edge of my property line. As I walked closer, it came into focus, a brand new structure. Small, cheap, beige vinyl siding badly hammered together like some kind of budget information kiosk you'd find outside a strip mall. There was a roof, a little bulletin board, a ridiculous HOA crest printed on plastic and screwed into the front Canyon Ridge East Annex Information Center. I stared at it for a good 30 seconds before it registered that yes, this insane little outhouse was very real, and yes, it was. Sitting inches from my boundary stakes, close enough that one wrong gust of wind could knock it over onto my property. My wife stepped out of the trailer, followed my gaze, and froze. "Oh my God," she whispered. She built a propaganda booth. That's exactly what it was. Inside the bulletin board were laminated sheets, full-color glossy, professionally printed. I leaned in to read them, and then I felt my blood run cold. There were grainy, zoomed-in photos of me working on the shed, photos of my wife carrying lumber, photos of my kids playing with the chickens. Every image taken from far away with a telephoto lens, the angles unmistakable. These were shot from the ridge from someone spying on us. Under each picture were captions in bold red font, unsafe conditions, unpermitted occupancy, non-compliant structures, ongoing investigation. It was like flipping through a smear campaign designed by a lunatic. At the bottom of the board was a QR code leading to a website titled The Truth About the West Family. I scanned it, and there it was, a page full of lies so outrageous it would have been funny if it weren't meant to ruin us. Claims that we were illegally diverting water. Claims that we brought in undocumented workers. Claims that our chickens carried disease risk. The worst part was a donation link at the top: Help Protect HOA Integrity. Contribute today. Payment processed via PayPal. Recipient Karen S. She wasn't just smearing us, she was fundraising off it. I stood there trembling, not from fear, but from a cold fury I hadn't felt in years, the type that hits just before you strike the final blow. My wife touched my arm. "We have to report this." "Oh," I said quietly, "I plan to do a lot more than report it." Before I did anything else, I took photos from every angle: kiosk, flyers, timestamp, GPS coordinates. I printed copies, labeled them, filed them into the growing mountain of evidence. Then I called the only journalist I trusted, Erin from the Regional Gazette. She was the one who had covered boundary disputes before. A tough woman with a notebook that seemed to terrify local officials. "You're going to want to come see this," I told her. She arrived within 2 hours, wearing boots, jeans, and that denim jacket that looked like it had survived 5 wildfires. When she saw the kiosk, her jaw actually dropped. "Good God," she said. This is insane." "No," I corrected her. "This is Karen." She spent an hour taking photos, interviewing us, interviewing neighbors, and going through the flyers. At one point she shook her head and muttered, "I've covered some crazy HOA stories, but this is a cult with a clipboard." She left promising to write something that'll light up the county. And she did. 2 days later, the Gazette published HOA Escalates Dispute with Surveillance Tactics and False Accusations. The article spread fast. Faster than I expected. Residents from all over the county posted it on Facebook. Someone uploaded pictures of the kiosk to an HOA watchdog forum. A YouTube channel that covered HOA horror stories made a reaction video. Canyon Ridge's dirty laundry was now flapping in the wind for the entire state to see. And the HOA's next move came quicker than I expected. Late that afternoon, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. A shaky voice introduced herself as Lindsay, a former resident from Canyon Ridge. "Is this the man the HOA is harassing? That would be me." She exhaled shakily. I left that place because of Karen. She fined me $300 for having a doghouse she said was the wrong shade of red. I couldn't fight her, no one could. She ran that neighborhood like a monarchy. I pulled out my legal pad. "Tell me everything." And she did. Then another call came in, then another, then another. By the 4th call, I realized this wasn't a coincidence. Karen hadn't just been bullying me, she had been terrorizing this community for years. People had simply endured it, moved away quietly, or given up. And now that someone was fighting back and publicly, they were coming out of hiding. One man named Dave, yes, a second Dave, told me he used to serve on the board until Karen began overriding votes, declaring meetings invalid if they didn't go her way, and rewriting minutes. A woman named Marcy had been fined for a non-compliant mailbox. Another resident received a violation for having a trampoline visible from the street. Someone else said Karen replaced half the board with her own relatives. Patterns. Patterns everywhere. These weren't random acts of pettiness. This was a system. When I hung up the last call, my evidence binder had expanded by at least 30 pages, all sworn statements and documented experiences of Karen's abuses. The next morning, before I had time to process everything, the Arizona Department of Real Estate contacted me again. "We've reviewed the materials you submitted," one inspector said. "We're escalating this investigation. We'll need to interview several current and former HOA members." When a government voice says escalating, you know things are about to get serious. Meanwhile, Karen was unraveling. She had been exposed publicly. Her kiosk was the laughingstock of the county. Her forged documents were under state review. Former residents were turning against her. And the prosecutor was building a file thick enough to crush a lesser dictator. But just when I thought she'd reached the bottom of her madness, she found a new level. A lower level. A desperate level. The sun was setting when she arrived in her SUV again, not speeding this time but creeping like a predator licking its wounds. She stepped out wearing a beige pantsuit and clutching a clipboard like it was a shield. "You will regret this," she hissed across the property line. Instead, I sat on the tailgate and dialed an old colleague, someone who had survived more property disputes than I had. A quiet, meticulous man named Howard, who now worked at the county recorder's office. When I explained the situation, he sighed the way government employees sigh when someone tries to overthrow zoning laws using crayons and confidence. "Send me everything," he said, "and expect a call from the prosecutor's office." Her cousin, her sister-in-law, the seal was hand-drawn, with a pen, and she had spelled enforcement wrong. I almost laughed. But instead, I filed it carefully into my evidence folder and whispered, "You just added another nail to your own coffin." Because Karen wasn't just losing control, she was actively documenting her own destruction, and I was collecting every piece. I spent that night sitting at the folding table with a dim lantern glowing over my evidence pile stacks of forged documents, screenshots, witness statements, GIS overlays, surveillance captures. It didn't look like the file of a homeowner protecting his land anymore. It looked like the casebook of a prosecutor preparing an indictment, and in many ways that's exactly what it was becoming. Just after dawn, while my coffee was still too hot to drink, my phone buzzed. It was the Navajo County Prosecutor's Office. "Mr. West," the voice said, "Assistant District Attorney Morales, we've obtained a preliminary order to subpoena Canyon Ridge HOA's internal records. The sheriff will serve it today." I didn't even realize I was smiling until my wife walked out and saw me. "What's going on?" she asked. I handed her the phone so she could hear the last part, and once we review their communications, we anticipate updating the scope of the investigation. "Please prepare any additional evidence you may have." She hung up, eyes wide. "This is happening, isn't it?" "Oh, it's happening," I said. "Today is going to be the beginning of the end for Karen." But I underestimated just how fast that end would come into view. Around noon, I received a text from Dave, the first neighbor who'd come to warn me about Karen. The message was short: "You might want to come by the HOA office. The sheriff's here. And it's a mess." I didn't hesitate. I jumped in my truck and drove the mile down the dusty road to the Canyon Ridge Community Center, a tan stucco building the HOA used for meetings, fines, and petty tyrannies. By the time I arrived, 3 sheriff cruisers were parked out front. Residents were gathered in small clusters, whispering like spectators at a funeral. And standing by the doorway, red-faced and shaking, was Karen's cousin, one of her hand-picked board members. Inside the office, through the glass windows, I saw the sheriff handing papers to the HOA's registered agent. It was the subpoena, a thick one. Karen herself was nowhere in sight. People turned their heads when I stepped out of my truck. Not in hostility, more like curiosity and maybe a little relief, as if seeing the one person who'd finally forced the issue made everything real. One woman, probably in her 70s, stepped forward and whispered, "You're the man they tried to force out, aren't you?" "Yes, ma'am." She nodded gravely. "Good. Someone needed to stand up to them. We were all too scared." I thanked her and walked closer to the door, but I didn't need to go inside. I could hear enough from where I stood. One of the sheriff's deputies was questioning the board's treasurer, a nervous man in a wrinkled polo shirt. "Where are the financial ledgers?" the deputy asked. The treasurer wiped sweat from his forehead. "We don't have all of them. You're required to maintain records." "I know, but Karen took some home." "Which ones?" "All of them," he whispered. That was all I had to hear. I walked back to my truck, heart pounding, not from fear, but from the electricity of seeing the system finally catching up to Karen. They weren't just looking at my case anymore. They were digging into every fine, every fee, every secret meeting. By early evening, I was back at my property reorganizing the binders yet again, labeling new sections: financial fraud, federal land, misuse, harassment, timeline. As I worked, I heard my wife gasp outside. I stepped out of the trailer. A county vehicle had arrived, and stepping out were 2 investigators from the Arizona Attorney General's office. Not inspectors. Not local deputies. State-level investigators. "Mr. West," the lead agent said, "we'd like to review the federal land portion of your documentation." They stayed for 4 hours. They reviewed GIS overlays, cross-checked BLM parcel IDs, examined copies of HOA documents, and listened carefully as I explained every step of Karen's attempted expansion. They nodded, took notes, recorded statements, asked sharp, deliberate questions. But it wasn't until one of the agents flipped to the section about the HOA selling exclusive access to land they didn't own that things changed. His eyebrows shot up. "Is this verified?" he asked. "Yes. We cross-checked every lease with BLM records. And you're positive they used these leases to collect dues?" "Positive." He leaned toward his partner. "This might trigger federal involvement." Federal involvement. The thread Karen had pulled had now reached all the way to the state and possibly beyond. She had no idea what kind of avalanche she had started. When the agents left, my wife closed the door behind them, leaned her back against it, and exhaled the kind of breath you release after months of pressure. "Did we really just talk to the Attorney General's office?" she whispered. "We did. And they said federal." "They did." She shook her head. "Karen has no idea what's coming." She was right, but she was about to get a taste. The next morning, while I was tightening the steel brackets on the cabin foundation, a white SUV crawled up the ridge again. I recognized it instantly, not HOA, not security, but Karen's personal vehicle. She parked closer than she ever had, practically nose to nose with my boundary stakes. She got out, but she wasn't storming this time. There was no clipboard, no shouting, no aggressive posture. She looked shaken. Her eyes darted across my laminated signs. Her jaw clenched. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached the property line. "You think you've won?" she hissed. "I think I said calmly that I've told the truth. And the truth is doing the rest." Her mouth twisted. "You have no idea what you're getting into." "Karen," I said, "you forged county documents. You trespassed. You used fake security. You sold access to federal land. You spied on my family. You tried to steal property that never belonged to you." She flinched at the word federal. I continued, "This isn't an HOA dispute anymore. This is criminal." Her breath quickened. She looked past me at the cabin frame, the chickens, my kids playing near the trench. And for the first time since the day we met, she didn't look powerful. She looked cornered. "Just stop," she whispered. "Please. Stop filing complaints. Stop sending evidence. Stop talking to investigators." "I'm protecting my home," I said. "You'll destroy everything," she said. "I'm not the one who built my empire on lies." Her lips trembled, and for a split second, she looked like a frightened person standing on the edge of a cliff of her own making. "They'll audit everything," she said. "Yes, they'll talk to the board. They already have. They'll look at the money. I'm sure they will." She stared at the dirt. "Then I'm finished." I didn't say anything. Some truths don't need to be spoken aloud. She turned slowly, walked back to her SUV, and drove away. Not fast, not angry, not triumphant, but hollow. I watched her taillights disappear behind the ridge and felt nothing. No gloating, no thrill, just an unexpected sadness. Because no matter how awful she had been, it was still tragic to see a person crumble under the weight of their own corruption. But the story wasn't done. That afternoon, I received a call from ADA Morales. "Mr. West," she said, "based on recent findings and interviews, a warrant has been issued for the arrest of one Karen Stoddard." My hand tightened around the phone. "For what charges?" I asked. "Forgery, fraud, harassment, and conspiracy to interfere with private property rights for now. Additional charges are being reviewed." For a moment, I didn't speak. Then I let out a slow breath. Justice had finally started moving, and it was moving fast. The call from ADA Morales echoed in my head long after I hung up. An arrest warrant. For Karen. For weeks, I'd been preparing for this possibility, building binders, gathering evidence, documenting everything. But hearing it spoken aloud officially made the whole thing feel less like a war I was fighting alone and more like justice finally taking its first steps down the ridge. My wife came out of the trailer as I lowered the phone. She saw my expression and froze. "What happened?" "They issued a warrant." Her hand flew to her mouth. For her, I said. "Forgery, harassment, fraud, conspiracy," and Morales said more charges are being reviewed. She sank onto the porch step, exhaling shakily. "It's really happening." "Yeah," I said quietly. "It is." We sat in silence for a long moment, letting the news settle into our bones. But the quiet wasn't meant to last. Around 4 p.m., I heard the gravel crunching under tires. Fast. Too fast. I stepped outside expecting another neighbor maybe, or a deputy. But it wasn't either. It was Karen's sister-in-law, the same woman who'd signed half the fake HOA citations. The same woman whose signature appeared twice under fabricated enforcement notices. The same woman caught on camera the week before tearing down one of my boundary markers at 2 in the morning. She pulled up in a dusty gray sedan, slammed the door, and marched right up to my fence line like she owned the earth beneath her. "You ruined her life," she shouted. I didn't move. She ruined her own life. "No," she screamed, voice trembling. "You did. You brought the county. You brought the state. You made a spectacle out of her. Out of all of us," I stepped forward but stayed behind the boundary flag. "Your cousin forged government seals," I said. "She trespassed. She sold land she didn't own. She harassed dozens of people. You're not the only ones coming forward. Her eyes darted back and forth, as if searching for something, anything that could be used against me. She jabbed a finger toward the laminated maps on my fence. "These signs are lies," she shouted. "They're county documents," I said evenly. "You provoked her," she snapped. "You made her desperate. That's what happens," I said, when a bully finally hits someone who hits back. She glared at me, chest rising and falling rapidly. "We're not finished." "Yes," I said quietly. "You are." Her face hardened into something ugly, fear, mixed with anger and a sinking realization that the ground beneath her was giving way. She spun on her heel and stormed back to her car. The engine revved tires, spit gravel, and she sped away in a cloud of dust and panic. I watched her disappear over the ridge, and a cold feeling settled into my gut. Desperation makes people unpredictable. That night, my suspicion proved right. At 2:14 a.m., my phone pinged. Trail camera alert. Motion detected. I tapped the notification expecting maybe a stray animal or wind-blown debris. But no. There she was, Karen's sister-in-law, holding a flashlight in one hand and a shovel in the other, on my land, kneeling beside one of my concrete boundary markers, digging, not to remove it, not to destroy it, but to shift it, just a few inches. Just enough to later claim boundary confusion. A trick only a desperate person with a lot to lose would try. She worked for nearly 10 minutes, repositioning the marker, patting the dirt, wiping her hands on her sweater. Then she hurried back toward a dark SUV I hadn't seen earlier. She stopped once, looking back at the boundary line, as if searching for a final justification for her actions, then climbed into the vehicle and drove off without turning her headlights on. I downloaded the footage immediately. 3 angles. One from the South Ridge camera, one from the chicken coop camera, one from the infrared unit I'd placed behind the storage shed. Crystal clear, time-stamped, undeniable. The next morning, I emailed the footage directly to Ada Morales and copied the Attorney General's office. The subject line was simple: final act of desperation. Within 15 minutes, Morales replied, "Thank you. We are adding this to the existing charges. Do not engage, we'll handle it." That phrase, "we'll handle it," was becoming one of my favorites. But the biggest shift happened not on my land, but back at Canyon Ridge. Word had spread that the sheriff was looking for Karen. She hadn't been home for 2 days. Residents formed small knots of conversation on sidewalks and cul-de-sacs. Rumors blossomed faster than weeds after monsoon season. I heard them from multiple sources. She forged maps, she forged a seal, they're calling it racketeering. Federal land. Are you kidding? I heard half the board is under investigation. Someone said she ran HOA funds into personal accounts. Fear had turned the once proud HOA into a cluster of quiet, shaky faces. The empire of beige was cracking, and then the crack became a canyon. Late afternoon, a convoy of county vehicles pulled into Canyon Ridge, 3 cruisers, an unmarked car, and a black SUV with government plates. I stayed on my property, but from my ridge I could see everything. Residents peeked from windows. Some stepped outside. A few filmed with their phones. Deputies knocked on Karen's door. No answer. They circled the house. Then, in a moment that would later show up all over social media, 2 deputies retrieved her from the back of her sister-in-law's house, 3 streets over. She was handcuffed, hair disheveled, face contorted in a mixture of rage and disbelief. She shouted loud enough that I heard echoes from across the ridge. "You can't do this. This is my community. I am the board. I am the law." The deputy said something I couldn't hear. Karen screamed back, "This is harassment. He did this to me, that man on the hill." She was pointing in my direction. I simply stood there, arms crossed, watching from hundreds of feet away as the law finally did what it was always meant to do. When they put her in the cruiser, she kicked the door so hard the whole car shook. A deputy calmly closed it again and locked it. The convoy drove off. The HOA residents remained in stunned silence, and just like that, the tyrant of Canyon Ridge was gone. But the war wasn't over. If anything, this was just the collapse before the crash. The next morning, Canyon Ridge HOA tried to hold an emergency board meeting. Only 3 members showed up, and one of them, Karen's cousin, cried the entire time. Another member asked about the subpoena. Another asked about the finances. Another whispered, "We're going to get dissolved, aren't we?" I didn't need to hear the answer. I already knew it. When you build your kingdom on lies, the truth doesn't just break it, it pulverizes it. Little did any of them know. The final blow was coming faster than anyone expected. 3 days after Karen's arrest, a strange kind of quiet settled over the ridge. It wasn't peaceful, not yet. It was the silence that comes after an explosion, when the dust hasn't quite settled, and everyone's still blinking through the haze trying to understand what just happened. Canyon Ridge HOA had gone dark. No newsletters. No patrols. No warnings taped to mailboxes. No Karen. Just the distant sound of the wind rattling saguaros and the whisper of a community realizing its queen bee had been a hornet all along. I spent those days tightening the bolts on the cabin frame, digging posts, hauling lumber, trying to return to normal life in whatever small ways I could. But every time I looked toward the subdivision, I could feel that something big was brewing. And on the fourth morning, it came. A letter. Certified. County seal. Real, not forged. When I opened it, I felt heat rise in my chest. Not anger, but a rising swell of vindication. It was a summons. Not for me, for Canyon Ridge HOA. They were officially being brought before the county court for fraud, forgery, abuse of authority, boundary manipulation, unauthorized land use, harassment, and potential civil RICO violations. It was all there. Every thread I'd pulled, every piece of proof I'd collected, every document Karen forged, every lie she printed, every trespass her people committed, it all sat neatly cataloged in one official notice. And the most important line of all, the court will consider the full dissolution of Canyon Ridge HOA. The entire HOA, the whole structure, gone. When I told my wife, she didn't say anything. She just leaned into me, resting her head against my shoulder. She'd carried the weight of this war as much as I had. That afternoon, neighbors began showing up, one by one, people who had once lived under Karen's shadow, with shoulders hunched and eyes lowered. Dave brought a case of root beer. Lindsay brought homemade cookies. A younger couple brought folding chairs and nervous smiles. One by one, they told their stories, violations for meaningless things, threats of liens, anonymous complaints, fines for trivial issues. It was unbelievable how much damage one HOA president had done simply because no one had stood up to her. "You saved us," Lindsay said softly. "All of us." I shook my head. "I didn't save anyone. I fought for my land. You all deserved better long before I showed up." But they didn't agree. And the truth was, I knew this wasn't just about my land anymore. The day of the court hearing arrived a week later. I didn't dress up, just clean jeans, boots, and a flannel shirt. My wife sat beside me in the courtroom, hands clasped, jaw set with quiet determination. Behind us, more than 30 residents from Canyon Ridge filled the benches, some whispering, some crying, all waiting for justice. Canyon Ridge, HOA's legal team, if you could call it that, consisted of 2 nervous board members and an overworked attorney with an accordion folder so thin it couldn't have held more than 10 pages. We, on the other hand, rolled in with 4 binders, a box of exhibits, 3 USB drives, and more evidence than they could ever hope to refute. The judge entered. Everyone rose. And then the real reckoning began. The county prosecutor opened with a concise summary. For years, Canyon Ridge HOA has engaged in systemic harassment, fraudulent boundary claims, misuse of federal land, forged documents, unauthorized expansion, and intimidation tactics against residents and non-residents alike. The case before us includes over 200 pieces of documented evidence. The HOA attorney tried to object, tried to argue, tried to stall, but the judge shut him down at every turn. Then came the presentation of evidence. One by one, I watched the county projector display everything we had collected. The forged seals, the fake maps, the nighttime trespassing footage, the expansion map, drawn with mismatched coordinates, GIS overlays proving federal land violations, testimonies from former residents, my own trail camera recordings, Karen's kiosk, and the defamatory flyers, emails showing coercion and manipulation, and finally, Karen's own message to her inner circle. "We'll exhaust him with paperwork, box him in with public pressure. He'll either sell or leave." When that last email appeared on the screen, an audible gasp rippled through the courtroom. The HOA attorney buried his face in his hands. One board member started crying. Another whispered, "I told her this would happen." By noon, the judge didn't need a recess, didn't need deliberation, didn't need time. The verdict was swift. He leaned forward, steepled his fingers, and spoke with a calm finality that wiped the floor with Karen's entire regime. Canyon Ridge HOA has engaged in systematic fraud, harassment, and manipulative governance. All enforcement powers are hereby revoked. All fines issued within the last 4 years are null and void. And effective immediately, the Canyon Ridge Homeowners Association is dissolved. Gasps, whispers, a few cheers that the judge had to silence. But then he continued. The individuals responsible for forged documents, financial misconduct, and intentional boundary deception will face separate civil and criminal proceedings. Separate, civil, and criminal. My wife squeezed my hand. I felt a lump in my throat I hadn't realized was there. The HOA attorney looked as though he might faint. One board member actually did. Paramedics had to be called. After the ruling, I stepped outside into the cool midday sun. For a moment, everything went quiet. A trick only a desperate person with a lot to lose would try. She worked for nearly 10 minutes, repositioning the marker, patting the dirt, wiping her hands on her sweater. Then she hurried back toward a dark SUV I hadn't seen earlier. She stopped once, looking back at the boundary line, as if searching for a final justification for her actions, then climbed into the vehicle and drove off without turning her headlights on. I downloaded the footage immediately. 3 angles. We drove home across the ridge in near silence, still absorbing the enormity of what had just happened. When we reached the property, the kids ran out to greet us, chickens scattering around their feet. And as I stood there looking out at the land we fought to protect, I finally felt the weight lifting. Not gone, not forgotten, but lighter. That evening, under a sky streaked with desert pinks and oranges, my wife brought out the final piece we'd been working on secretly, a metal sign we designed after the kiosk incident. We carried it to the eastern boundary, the same spot where Karen's ridiculous propaganda booth once stood. I dug a small hole, set the metal post, and secured it with concrete. The sign read, "Federal Boundary Certified, No HOA Beyond This Line," and below, in smaller letters, "Private Land. Constitutionally protected. Proceed with caution." I stepped back and let the twilight settle over it. My wife slipped her hand into mine. "We did it," she whispered. "Yeah," I said. "We did." A year later, the land is almost unrecognizable from that first dusty day we arrived. The house stands strong, the garden is lush, the chickens act like they own the place. And right where Karen's kiosk once stood, there's now a sandstone monument with a polished steel plaque, the kind of tribute only a long, hard battle can justify. It reads, "Here stood the last bad idea of Canyon Ridge HOA." Sometimes people driving RVs or off-grid seekers stop by to take pictures. Some leave notes, some come to learn. And I always take time to teach them how to read plat maps, how to defend their land, how to recognize fraud. Knowledge is the only fence a bully can never knock down. Karen, she's in prison now. 8 years. Turns out her unlicensed security contractor was already under federal investigation, and her forged documents pushed the whole operation into racketeering territory. The system she built became the cage she now sits in. Sometimes late at night, I still remember the first time I saw her SUV rolling up that dirt road. The arrogance, the declarations, the assumption that power belonged to whoever shouted the loudest. But then I step outside, breathe the clean Arizona air, look up at the stars no one can regulate, and I smile. Because no matter how loud the HOA screamed, no matter how many papers they forged, no matter how many lines they pretended to redraw, this land remembers, the law remembers, and now people do too. When I look back on everything that happened, the lesson isn't about HOAs or property lines or forged documents. It's about something deeper, something I wish every homeowner, every landowner, every ordinary person understood. Bullies thrive in silence. Corrupt systems grow in the shadows. And injustice survives when good people decide it's easier to walk away than to fight. I didn't win because I was stronger. I didn't win because I was smarter. I won because I refused to accept lies as truth. Because I documented everything. Because I believe that facts, law, and persistence still matter even when the world feels loud and unfair. If you're listening to this, ask yourself, what lines in your life need defending? What boundaries, physical or emotional, need reinforcing? What truth needs your voice? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Share your own HOA nightmare if you've faced one. And if you want more stories like this about justice, grit, and standing your ground, don't forget to subscribe. Sometimes all it takes to change everything is one person who refuses to back down.